Hello, Magic Card Seller. I'm going into a cEDH game, and I need your strongest magic cards. My cards are too expensive for you, traveller. Card Seller, I only have time for one game. I'm telling you, I need your strongest magic cards. You can't handle my magic cards, traveller. They're too expensive for you. You'd best find someone who sells cheaper magic cards. Well, Foyfluff just uploaded a video on 50 budget cEDH cards. Oh, well, you'd best watch that then, I suppose. I will, Card Seller. I will watch it and I will never return here. Today we're going to be looking at 50 budget cEDH staples that are very powerful but don't cost the earth. These cards are very cheap but could have a very disproportionate effect on the power level of your deck. So we're going to go through 50 of those cards and why they're so good and played in cEDH. But just before we get into that, in the last video I inserted a little joke about how it's proven that reminding people to subscribe just after the hook of a video is a really effective way of growing your community, and it worked incredibly well. Thank you everyone. We're now over 1,000 subscribers and are officially a part of the YouTube Partner Program, which is absolutely incredible. We've got £10.99 saved up in that revenue already. So if you're enjoying this content and want to stick around to see more, please do consider subscribing and joining this fantastic community that is on the rise. Okay, so now that you've clicked that subscribe button, let's get into it. Now 50 cards might sound like a lot to get through in just one video, but I've broken them down into categories that happen to pretty closely align with the deck building tips from the last video. So today we'll be looking at some mana accelerants, some protection spells, some card advantage spells, some card selection spells, and a few miscellaneous choices. Alright, let's start with the biggest category, but likely the easiest to explain, with those mana accelerants. Within the mana accelerant category, we've got three sub-themes. The first is ritual effects, and there's only three pretty cheap ones: Dark Ritual, Culling the Weak, and High Tide. Dark Ritual is close to an auto-include in any black deck. Generating 2 extra mana can give you a very explosive turn, the tempo from which could propel you all the way to a win. Culling the Weak actually generates 1 more mana than the ritual does, but requires a tiny bit of setup in having a creature on the board, which for some decks can be a struggle. It's best in a deck that either has a pretty high creature count or creates tokens in some way, especially if they're made by the commander itself, such as with Najeela the Blade Blossom. High Tide is the last of the cheap rituals, and it's the most restrictive as well, really forcing you to be very heavily blue, if not mono blue. However, it does provide an incredibly compelling reason to do so by doubling the effect of all your islands. In fact, there's a few cEDH decks built solely around the power of this one card, such as the Transforming Jace, which when it flips into a Planeswalker can recur the High Tide from the graveyard, making your islands 3 times as effective. Very cool. The second and third subcategories are very much two sides of the same coin, and they're easy enough to talk about at the same time. Mana Rocks and Mana Dorks, or artifacts that tap for mana and creatures that tap for mana. In cEDH, at least in terms of budget options, every artifact that taps for mana costs 2, and every creature that taps for mana costs 1. On the artifact side, we've got all 10 Signets, all 10 Talismans, and Felwar Stone. On the creature side, we've got a bunch of Elves, Avacyn's Pilgrim, Elves of Deep Shadow, Llanowar Elves, and Elvish Mystic. And for the majority of decks, you're going to want to play as many of both of these as your commander's colour identity will allow. The only reason you might not want them is if they somehow invalidate or contradict your strategy. For example, some decks utilise a lot of cards like Collector Oof or Kataki War's Wage or even Bane of Progress, so you probably don't want to be running many artifacts yourself, while some other decks like Polymorph or Divergent Transformations decks need to avoid playing any superfluous creatures. For pretty much any other strategy though, the extra mana that these cards add will make your deck do whatever it's looking to do much more quickly and much more consistently as a result. Lastly, sort of exempt from those three categories, but also very similar to Mana Rocks, is one card, Wild Growth, which occupies the prestigious position of being a 1 mana card that produces additional mana right next to Mana Vault. This card is great and should be in just about every green deck, and works even better with Arbor Elf in the deck as well. Some people do worry about their land being painted as a target because of the Wild Growth, but honestly there's a much bigger chance of your artifacts or creatures being blown up, and I mean they're still good enough to play, so Wild Growth is too. Category 2 comprises the protection element of your deck and helps you to deal with the problematic cards your opponents might be playing. But the first card I'm going to mention is one that doesn't actually protect you per se. Gitaxian Probe gives you information on one player's hand while also replacing itself and coming at the small cost of just 1 blue mana or 2 life. This makes it amazingly flexible, especially in any deck that cares about how many spells you can cast, but moreover, the information you can gather from this card is just incredibly useful. If you're about to go off, you can point it in the direction of the control player and see what you might need to be able to resolve your spells. If there's a combo player that you're worried about, check to see how close they are to winning. If in doubt, just cast it for a draw and see what you find out along the way. Great card. Contrastingly, counterspells are pretty straightforward and are spearheaded by the namesake card itself, which, if you're playing blue and you're not playing straight up counterspell, all I can say is that you best be playing Maelstrom Wanderer. Negate is also a really good one. Most of the scariest things in EDH are non-creatures, from planeswalkers to combo pieces to stacked cards. Negate deals with them all for a very low cost in terms of both mana and money. Speaking of Negate, Dovin's Veto does serious work in Counterspell Wars if you have the colours for it. Dispel is a little more limited and is best used as a counter spell, making it a really good fit for combo decks, but needs a little bit more thought in other strategies. Speaking of limitations, Red Elemental Blast is a little cheaper than Pyroblast and counters or destroys any blue thing. This might not be correct for your local meta, but you'd be hard pressed to find a cEDH table without any blue in it. Note that Blue Elemental Blast and Hydroblast aren't on this list because they're not considered cEDH staples, mostly as red isn't as heavily played in cEDH, and thus their inclusion is usually thought of as slightly too niche, but that might not be the case in your local scene. Spell Pierce is Negate, but cheaper for you to cast and cheaper for your opponents to get around. It's good at competitive tables where everyone is trying to be as efficient as possible, but it could very well fall flat against less well-optimized decks. The same goes for Mental Misstep, which is great when everyone is playing very efficient and cheap cards, but isn't so effective when against players jamming big dinosaurs, for example. But much more versatile are Drown in the Loch, which can be a counter spell or a kill spell depending on what you need and when you need it, and graveyards tend to fill up pretty quickly over the course of a game either way, and Muddle the Mixture is an incredible tutor and a not so bad counter spell for instants and sorceries when absolutely necessary. That's all for counterspells, so let's talk about getting things off the board once they've resolved. A lot of the scariest threats in Commander, and often the hardest to remove, are artifacts or enchantments, and if it's one of those you're looking to get rid of, Nature's Claim is the absolute best way to get rid of them, with the only downside being that their controller gains for life, which is actually something you can use to your advantage if you're in Death's Door yourself. Alternatively, there's Reclamation Sage, which costs 2 more but comes with a 2/1 body, but as it's a creature, it can be tutored up in some interesting ways. But if it's a creature you're looking to get rid of, Swords to Plowshares is the absolute best way to get rid of it, with the only downside being that you have to play white. Sometimes though, especially with opposing commanders, you want it dealt with, but not gone, as they could just recast it then. There's a few cards that can completely disable a commander, but the cheapest in terms of price and one of the best in terms of value is Kenrith's Transformation, which elks a creature, taking away all of its abilities and even creature types, and draws you a card, forces your opponents to find a way to kill their own commander if they want to be able to play it again. It's even good against non-commander high-value creatures, whether it's denying the card draw of a Dark Confidant or even just shrinking a big beater. There's a few cards with this effect, but by cantripping and being so cheap, this one is likely the best of them. For a blue mage though, dealing with a permanently can be tricky. For creatures, there's the incredible colour pie violations of Reality Shift and Rapid Hybridization, which sure leaves a body behind, but that's nothing compared to being able to deal with most creatures at instant speed. But for everything else, you're going to be looking at bounce effects. Blink of an Eye, or Into the Royal, they're identical, are good ways to temporarily deal with something and can cycle if you can afford the kicker cost. But Winds of Rebuke is also a popular choice because it can double as a win condition when paired with an Archaeomancer and a very large to infinite amount of mana. Use the Rebuke, mill everyone for 2, return it with the Archaeomancer, rebuke the Archaeomancer back to your hand and repeat the process until you've milled everyone out. Then pass the turn and allow everyone to lose to decking before it gets back around to yourself. Next up are card advantage spells. It is my firm belief that there is only one thing more fun than casting a Windfall with Narset Parter of Veils on your side of the board, and that is flashing in a Notion Thief in response to someone else's Windfall. And that's why these 3 cards are some of the most widely run in cEDH, despite boasting pretty cheap price tags. Fact or Fiction is another great card advantage spell that is incredibly fun to play. I remember one time my table forced me to pick between 1 Muldrifter and 4 other cards, and while it certainly wasn't the cEDH player, I snap-picked my Fishy Boy. But if you're interested in cEDH card advantage that isn't in blue, chances are you're looking at green. Runic Armasaur has a big booty and lets you draw whenever your opponents activate most non-mana abilities, which is pretty great. An all-game adversary is sometimes referred to as Green Bob, coming from Dark Confidant, as the cost reduction effect means he often only costs 2 mana, and his Death Touch plus the low number of creatures in most cEDH games means he should be able to find a player to hit and draw you a free card every turn. Sometimes though, it's not about how many cards you have, it's about which cards you have, and that's why card selection is an important component of your deck building. There's 2 subcategories to this. The first are tutors, which, in addition to the earlier Muddle the Mixture, which is likely the best budget tutor altogether, we have 2 great creature tutors in Eladamri's Call and Neoform. The second form of card selection spells are cantrips. Opt and Ponder have similar top-of-the-deck manipulation followed by drawing effects, while Brainstorm is the opposite and is best played if you have a shuffle effect to follow up with. If you play Anticipate, you should probably be playing Impulse instead, unless you're playing both, that is. Last is my favourite, Frantic Search, which has the benefit of being mana neutral, or might even generate mana if you have a land that produces several mana at once, like Nykthos or Cabal Coffers, while also digging 2 cards deep and filling up your graveyard. And lastly, we've got the Miscellaneous category. Now, 2 of the cards here could maybe have had their own category. Aven Mind Sensor and Grafdigger's Cage are both Stacks pieces. Now, it's been pointed out to me in my last video that I didn't talk much about Stacks decks, and that's very true because Stacks decks approach the game from an axis that is very different from most decks, but generally disliked. In my opinion, not because of the different axis, but actually because many Stacks players forget or purposefully choose not to include win conditions in their decks, which drags the game on unnecessarily with all these Stacks pieces that stop anyone from winning the game. To be competitive, and more importantly to be anywhere close to fun, Stacks pieces should be used as tools that set your opponents further behind than they set you. And I think both of these budget options do that quite well, and they're pretty versatile, just so long as the cage doesn't interrupt your own strategy, that is. And last is a card that is definitely very good, but just hasn't fit into any of these categories because it's a land. Exotic Orchard often functions as at least an untapped dual land, if not being able to tap for 3, 4, or even all 5 colours of mana. It's not going to completely revolutionise your deck, but there's a good chance you should be including it, and the most shocking thing about it is its low price tag, despite being a card that almost every commander deck should be playing. So it's one I'd suggest getting a hold of a few copies of before maybe it spikes in price. And that, believe it or not, was over 50 cards that are commonly played in cEDH decks that you can get for incredibly cheap. Now, you might have noticed a disproportionate amount of blue and green in there, with a bit of black and not very much white or red at all. I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone to hear that white and red are not the strongest colours in Commander, but I think there is some unexplored space here, so I want to know from you guys in the comments, what's your pick for a powerful budget option in either red or white? I'll start with By Force, a red spell that blows up X artifacts for X+1 mana, which is very solid in a format where everyone is ramping out with artifacts. I've seen some people suggest release the Gremlins, but in my experience, the 2/2 Gremlins aren't worth doubling the mana cost of the card for. The earlier you can cast, the better, and By Force remains a very powerful spell that can be cast at almost any point in the game. But now it's your turn. Let me know your pick for strong budget picks in white or red in the comments section below. And that's all that I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, and if you found this video entertaining or informative, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like, maybe subscribe to the channel, and share the video around, send it to your playgroup, send it to your friends, anyone that you think might enjoy it. It really helps the channel out, and we've been doing fantastically lately, so we're just hoping to see the positive trajectory of the channel continue. That would be really great. Anyway, that is all from me, so thank you very much, and I hope that you have a lovely day.